Okay. Namaste.
Namaste.
Professor Shyam Ranganathan, Department of Philosophy, York Center for Asian Research, York University, Toronto. Dr. Gītā Nirban, co-convener of a webinar series. Dear viewers who are interested in Mahabharata scholarship, who have been supporting us and continuously participating in the event and making it very vibrant. I welcome you all to our webinar series on Mahabharata, initiated under the project Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gītā, the ethical value of societal and political well-being, which is taken up under the scheme of promotion of academic research and collaboration, Ministry of Human Resource Development. Now it is changed as Ministry of Education, Government of India. Our team includes Professor Vishwa Adluri, Professor of Philosophy, Hunter College, USA, Dr. Joydeep Bagchi, Hindu University of America, USA, Dr. Gītā Nirban, Kamala Nehru College, Delhi University, Delhi, and me, Professor Bala, presently heading the Department of Philosophy at Delhi University. And we are supported by a young team of scholars, Ms. Jayashree and Ms. Anmol. Along with them, we have an extended team of Ms. Deepshika and Megha, who are supporting us in this project. And this project, titled Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gītā, the ethical value for societal and political well-being, is taken up with certain objectives. And one of the objectives is to build a new approach to yoga that combines theoretical and practical perspectives. And it also intends to understand yoga beyond a set of postures as an overarching term for salvic practices, and to see how it is embedded in social and political reality. This is very underlining thing for us, like how it is embedded in social and political reality. And we also intend to reappropriate texts of classical Hinduism, which have suffered from Orientalist approaches, in order to articulate the vision of yoga consciousness. And we focus to demonstrate how answers to questions of right action at societal and political levels can be explored through the conception of yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gītā that transcends sectarian and doctrinal boundaries to create a global system of thought and practice. To explicate the universal, philanthropic, and humanitarian aspects of Hinduism as echoed in Mahabharata is another important objective of this project that we have taken up. To list out or to specify certain things, like we have 3 pointers that we have come up with in this project. One is yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and the ethical values of societal well-being, ethical value of political well-being. These are the focused pointers that we have picked up, which we will be dealing with in this project. If it is to be asked, like, what is the question that is being addressed, major question that is being addressed in this project, then the question would be, what is the right course of action and how do we determine that? This is the major one that we will be dealing with from societal as well as political perspectives and also ethical perspectives. So that's the main focus of the project that we have taken up. So far in this webinar series, we had lectures on yoga consciousness, we had lectures on social well-being, political well-being, dharma, concept of dharma, ethical values, and also the author, Vyasa, on Vyasa himself. We had a wonderful discussion previously. Now, today, we are going to have a talk on justice and consciousness and Arjuna's transformation, as we have already understood and try to repeat it again and again, so that we understand the sense of the term. Like, Mahabharata is a living tradition. If it is a living tradition, how do you see it in your life? And also, when you understand a tradition to be a living tradition, it's one of the aspects is that it is being performed again and again in various parts of the country, but it is not that it is performed by certain performers in a particular certain kind of situation. It is that probably each one of us also would be performing certain kinds of perspectives that are presented in Mahabharata. That is how we have to look back to each one of these characters, which try to represent one perspective or the other of various ethical positions that we come across in the world now. So, which gives us a lot of hints and hopes for our ethical well-being, and which would really support our conception of or widen our conception of ethical well-being and social well-being. And we would be, I hope, Professor Shyam would be dealing with these concerns along with justice and consciousness. This is the focused one that we would be dealing with, because we understand at the end of the day that there is a kind of transformation that has happened in Arjuna in the discourse after the discourse of Bhagavad Gita. So we really eagerly look forward to your talk, Professor Shyam. And now I request Dr. Gītesh to take over and introduce Professor Shyam to the audience. Dr. Gītesh, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar to everyone. Here we are in the 16th week of webinar series under the ongoing Spark project on yoga consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, as just now shared by Dr. Bala. Before we proceed, I request all the participants to keep the audio muted and videos off so that we can have a seamless flow of today's session too. Well, we are very privileged to have amongst us Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. He's at the Department of Philosophy, York University, Toronto. His areas of academic specialization are Asian philosophy, especially South Asian, Indian philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of religion, philosophy of thought, political philosophy, philosophy of race, theoretical ethics, including normative ethics and meta-ethics, as well as South Asian religion. As a scholar, Dr. Shyam has many publications to his credit in form of books, edited volumes, chapters in the books, articles in renowned journals. To name a few, his books include Hinduism, a contemporary philosophical investigation from New York Routledge in 2019, Ethics and History of Indian Philosophy from Delhi, Motilal Banarsidass, and Patanjali Yoga Sutra, translated into English from Sanskrit with a commentary and an introduction from Penguin Black Classic series. Alongside, he's also edited a volume, the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics. He's designed the Ethics MA Level 1 course under the aegis of EPG Pathshala program of Department of Higher Education, India in 2016. He's on the editorial board of the Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of Philosophers and has also been the area editor of Indian philosophy for the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Dr. Shyam, welcome you to the Spark platform. We are very honored to have you amongst us, and just want to convey to all the participants, as Dr. Bala has already shared, that Dr. Shyam is going to be shedding light on justice and consciousness, Arjuna's transformation. So we are here all for you, Dr. Shyam, today to listen to you. And now I hand it over to Dr. Shyam.
Thanks so much, everyone. I hope you can hear me well or sufficiently. So I'm going to turn on my presentation now. So I'm going to share the screen. And so I'm going to begin by going back. I'm not going to read everything here. I just have this as a reference. So I went and copied. This is the Ganguly translation of some of the key discussion that occurs at, I think, a pivotal junction in the Mahabharata when the game of dice is coming to a head and Draupadi is staked in the gamble, right? And so she finds out about it, and her discourse, of course, is remarkable, and everybody else's response is so disappointing. It's quite a section, and you know, things were okay up until that point. in the Mahabharata, insofar as the Pandavas, even though they were being harassed by the Kauravas, they still had some space for themselves to exist in. And things start to change very quickly at the game of dice. Of course, we know that it's rigged, so it's not a fair game of dice. And we also know that it's not as though the character, the Kauravas, is unknown to the Pandavas, and yet they participate. And then Draupadi is staked, and then, of course, we're all familiar with the story, but now that the Pandavas, Yudhishthira is going off, betting everything, and no one else is batting, and nobody stops him, right? Including Arjuna. And there's this description, the Pandavas who were filled with terrible wrath. So she shows up, so Draupadi shows up. So they're angry at this point that they've lost so much, but they don't seem to appreciate that it's their responsibility to prevent this from happening, right? It's like they're spectators at their own demise, even though they're getting there by virtue of their own either complicity or their explicit participation in foolishness. And she shows up, and she's annoyed, of course. She's angry, and there's this description that she looks at them, and they were not so distressed at having been robbed of their kingdom, of their wealth, of their costliest gems, as with the glance of Krishna, Draupadi, moved by modesty and anger, right? So somehow when they see her, they feel bad, but it was not as though they were they were really thinking about this, even though clearly they were entering into this demise, right? So Arjuna, I think it's like he's nowhere, he's not referred to, from what I can see, by name. He certainly doesn't speak up. Many called upon to intervene by Draupadi's charge that the proceedings are contrary to Dharma pass the buck, right? Including Bhishma, right? Bhishma's got the story to tell about how, Dharma is subtle, etc. And then he says, and women are usually under the control of their husbands. So what's interesting about Bhishma's remarks is that he's talking about conventional morality. So when he's talking about Dharma, it becomes coextensive with discussions of convention, right? And the distinction that Draupadi is trying to impress upon everybody, that there's a moral standard that you use to criticize ordinary goings-on, that goes over their heads. So Bhishma starts articulating, well, first of all, this kind of patriarchal moral framework where women don't really have any particular say over the life, certainly over the choices and decisions of their husbands. But there's also this conflation between conventional standards and Dharma. Okay, right. So then we know the first game is nullified by Dhritarashtra, and then they go at it again, and then they're thereby exiled. Really, I think in a way things are downhill once they're willing to stake Draupadi. They've basically lost, because they're willing to stake their own, sacrifice one of their own in order for the prospects of gain. So they've kind of transgressed this importance of solidarity, of protecting those under their own charge, right? And especially for rulers, this is quite a transgression. So what I want to do now is I want to step back before going any further and just talk about methodology for understanding philosophy. And I want to start because once we're clear about methodology, all of a sudden the various events in the Mahabharata and the discussion in the Gītā become clearer in a way that they're not. I think ordinarily they're quite opaque, and they're quite opaque because we're not very rigorous about our methodology for reading philosophy, and this has a lot to do with the West and its imperialism. But it's something that affects the study of South Asian philosophy particularly. for all sorts of historical reasons. But anyways, let's just put all of that, the historical issues aside, and just think about methodology. So when we're trying to understand philosophy, right, we're trying to understand reason, we're trying to understand philosophical arguments, and they are arguments, right? And so arguments are reasons in support of a conclusion. And what's really important about this is that the relationship between reasons and a conclusion is not reducible to what is true or what you believe is true. Okay, so this is Logic 101. There are three basic forms of reason, right? Deduction, induction, and abduction, or inference to the best explanation. I'm going to just focus on, deduction. But all reason shares this common thread, namely that it's not concerned with truth, but inferential support. Okay, and inferential support is a completely different standard of evaluation from what you take to be true. So this is kind of starkly apparent when we think about validity, right? So I'm always shocked that this is not something that is like front and center in people's consciousness, but speaking of consciousness, but you know, it's really so basic, right? So a valid deductive argument is an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. This is not the same as an argument where the premises and conclusions are true, right? And we find a parallel standard in judging inductive arguments where we have strength or relative merit. So here's just a way to, some examples to cash out validity. And I have a slightly old example down at the bottom, but it serves just as well. So the top argument, the moon is a squash. Squashes grow on vines, therefore the moon grows on a vine, right? So everything I said here is false, but this is a valid argument, because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Now consider the following argument where everything is true. Donald Trump is president of the United States in 2019, right? He was. Justin Trudeau is prime minister of Canada in 2019, right? You could change the, you know, Modi's the prime minister of Canada, as India in 2020, right? That would be true too. Therefore, Shyam Ranganathan is your presenter, right? Everything I said in the second argument is true, but it's nonsense. It's nonsense because the relationship between the premises and the conclusions doesn't have the virtue of inferential support. So even though the premises and the conclusion are true, it's not a reasonable argument. And in the first argument, the premises are not true, but it is reasonable. So truth and reason are two different kinds of considerations. This is one of the things I write a bit about is that this is, and I'll come back to this a bit later on, that this is this has everything, this kind of confusion about what reason is has everything to do with the Western tradition. From the very beginning, you read Plato, right, reason is described as this concern for truth. And there are kind of deep cultural reasons for why reason gets kind of mushed up and confused in discussions of Western tradition. But one of the results is that people mistakenly believe that being reasonable is about articulating the world in terms of what you take to be true, right? Which is simply a violation of very basic considerations of reason. Now, you put all this together, I think when we're reading philosophy, we should be doing what I call explicating. So to explicate is to uncover the reasons, either explicitly stated or entailed by what is said, that further entails a theory that entails the controversial claims made, right? So where did I learn this? I learned this actually from my philosophy professor. Nobody actually ever came out and said this explicitly when I was a student, but you know, I would take a course on metaphysics or ethics or epistemology. My job as a student was to read whoever it is I was reading and distill from that a theory that would then logically entail all the controversial claims that that philosopher was making about a controversial topic, right? So if I did that for Kant, I would distill Kant's theory of morality, right? And then I would use the same methodology, say, to read Mill, and I would distill Mill's theory of morality. In each case, the theory is entailed by what's said, and it further entails the controversial claims made by that philosopher. And then you do this recursively, and then you start to understand the topic of discussion in terms of what these competing theories disagree with. So when you employ explication, at no point are your beliefs or how you see the world a deciding factor in your evaluation, which is why we can teach philosophy and disagree with each other, right? So it's not as though we have to share a perspective in order to understand and converge on, say, Plato's theory of the forms or something, right? You could be a nominalist, I could be a realist, and we would come to the same understanding because we're ideally employing explication. Now, if we apply this to South Asian or Indian philosophy, right, what we would appreciate is that every darshana entails a theory about Dharma. And Dharma then is the concept that everybody's disagreeing about. And that concept is the right or the good, right? So every philosopher and every character, so if we switch to dialogues, right, we're now thinking about characters, right? People will, in context, be working with a theory of Dharma that entails their controversial claims about Dharma. So just because, so for instance, you know, I look at Bhishma and what he has to say about Dharma, I disagree, but that disagreement is possible because I understand the concept in terms of the controversy, right? And I understand what he's saying in terms of the theory that's entailed by his by the claims attributed to him, etc. All right, so you know, I have to thank the conveners for bringing attention to my work. So this is the cover of my first monograph, which was kind of the dressed up version of my MA in South Asian studies. It's, I think, an immature work. If I have to look back on all my stuff, I wrote it kind of, I knew enough philosophy to be dangerous, but not enough to really solve problems. But to my knowledge, it was the first time someone argued that, look, there's just one concept of Dharma, and what you're finding in the South Asian tradition is a disagreement about Dharma. And what is pretty normal is just the opposite. There are several concepts of meanings of Dharma, and there's no disagreement, right? Because the common view is that the meaning of Dharma is just whatever theoretical commitment is being articulated. And moreover, and I'll get to this, the weirder part that I notice is a kind of the standard way of going about this, is that the commentator, the contemporary commentator, what I call the Orthodox Indologist, uses their perspective on the world to decide what Dharma means every time it's said. Okay, so the Buddhist uses Dharma for you know, a constituent of reality. The contemporary Indologist says, well, what I would describe that as is constituent of reality, right? And then in another case, Manu uses Dharma to talk about high caste Brahminical rules. Then you know, that's what Dharma means, right? So in each case, the kind of the usual way, the kind of the very orthodox way in the field, is that the contemporary commentator uses their perspective to fix the meaning of Dharma. And so what ends up happening, and, you know, imagine your friend comes over and she's reporting to you all the good things that she saw when she went on a trip. And then what you did was systematically replace every claim she made about something good with what you would have said in that context, right? And at the end, it wouldn't make any sense. It would just be this disconnected, especially if your view of what's important diverges from your friends, right? It wouldn't happen if it was actually overlapping. But if your view of what's good diverges from your friends, as you systematically replace what she says about the good in terms of what you would have said, you would be left with just gobbledygook. And you'd have to say, well, there's no one story she's telling me about her values, to just kind of this disconnected observations of things, using the word good, right? So that's kind of the orthodox way that you know, people have gone about writing about Indian philosophy for, like, since the start of, well, actually, I think it's gotten even worse. When I look at some of the earlier stuff, I'm surprised at kind of the insight they had, and recently, especially post Gadamer and stuff like this. it ends up being the norm. So I'm showing this. I have an article coming out called Modes of Interpretation in the Encyclopedia of Religious Ethics. And I talk about interpretation a lot, but I'm quite happy with this article. So I'm bringing it up. So what people, you know, I think what's remarkable about the widespread use of interpretation is that it violates logic, right? Because a reasonable explanation is not an explanation in terms of what you take to be true. It has to do with inferential support. But insofar as people, the contemporary commentator decides that their perspective has to fix the content of what's being discussed, they're substituting what they take to be true with an account of what's being discussed in the text. So it's not just that this is biased, right? Which is, you might think is a problem, but it's irrational. That's the, and so this is, I think, part of, who knows, maybe 20 years from now I'll look back and go that this was a little immature, but I count this as kind of part of my more mature insight that what's going on is just methodologically confused, because instead of employing logic to understand Indian philosophy, contemporary commentators are just doing, they're engaging in a formal fallacy, right? It's not even like begging the question or ad hominem. Those are informal fallacies. Interpreting Indian philosophy by way of what you take to be true is a formal fallacy, right? Which makes it all the more outrageous that it's such a widespread practice and so demonstrably a departure from what we would teach students in introduction to logic classes, etc. is outrageous. So this is, you know, interpretation is basically you take your perspective and then you use it as the theoretical fund to account for what someone else is saying. So, right, so it produces this story, this conventional or orthodox story, that Dharma has many meanings, right? And correlatively, there's no tradition of moral and political philosophy in South Asia. It's all just spirituality, religion, etc. So why, you know, so it's the same methodology that creates both diagnoses, because insofar as the moral and political philosophy disappears from the secondary account of South Asian philosophy by way of the employment of interpretation, what you get afterwards is this account of South Asian philosophy is completely inexplicable, right? Oh, they use this word dharma for all sorts of different things. How confusing. They must have been in some kind of religious trance, right? That ends up being the dominant kind of received story. Now, what's the origins of this? So this is, I write about this all over the place, but I also write about it in, I have an article in the Routledge Handbook of Translation Philosophy. So I wrote my dissertation on translation, translation in general and translating philosophy in particular. And it was in that context that I started to appreciate the connection between interpretation and the Western tradition, right? Because one of the basic commitments of the Western philosophical tradition is what you could call the linguistic account of thought, which is thought is the meaning of what you say. It goes all the way back to the Greek idea of logos. It's a basic commitment of contemporary analytic and continental philosophy. Everybody thinks it's new with Frege, etc. It's not. It's as old as the Western tradition itself. And if you are committed to the idea that thought is the meaning of what you say, you blur the line between what you are willing to say and what's thinkable. And once you blur that line, then interpretation becomes the default methodology of understanding. So it's not surprising then. So one of the things that I notice is that not only is this irrationality the common method in Indology, when you read pivotal and influential philosophers in the 20th century, like Quine, early Davidson, even Wittgenstein, and if you read Heidegger, Gadamer, and even Derrida, they either explicitly endorse interpretation or tacitly do it in all sorts of implied ways, right? So, you know, and there's a little footnote in Word and Object. People read Quine less and less. I guess I'm part of that generation where my teachers read Quine, so I read Quine. But there's a little very famous footnote in Word and Object where Quine articulates, you know, the principle of charity, where you're trying to understand things by way of what you take to be true. And the idea is that, well, at the limits of our cultural competence, what else do we have to go on except for what we think is true, right? And so then that ends up being the methodology for understanding. Now, Quine was a logician, so this is also just mind-boggling. He should have known that that just violates every basic norm of logic. But I think the reason why this is not, people don't appreciate this, is that interpretation is just an outcome of very deep commitment to the Western tradition. And because it's so culturally embedded in this tradition, people tend not to be able to really have any insight into it. In order to have some insight into it, you have to be willing not to buy the Western tradition. You have to kind of culturally distinguish yourself in a way from the Western tradition. And I think in the context of Western imperialism, this is not something that people do. And it's not just Europeans. I think even South Asians, insofar as they buy stories of their own intellectual tradition as religious, etc., right? They are buying the Western narrative of South Asia. Okay, so what happens when you employ explication? So when I was editing the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics, and also when I was putting together the first year MA course in ethics for EPG Pacha, I had clarified explication, so it became an editorial principle for me. So I tried to encourage all the contributors to explicate as far as possible, and most did. And when you explicate, right, you commit to drawing a distinction between how you see the world, an account, and methodologically, and an account of the arguments and the theories of what you are studying as a philosopher. And when you explicate, you will discern that there are actually 4 basic ethical theories. And you arrive at this by, it's not something that you will come to just by studying one text or one tradition. It's about looking at the possibilities of disagreement altogether. And then what you will notice is that ethical theories take conflicting approaches to one concept that everybody disagrees about. Okay, and this concept is about the right or the good, right? So virtue theory is this idea that the good character is prioritized in an account of ethics, and then the right choice follows. So one of the things that we point out is that Jainism is an ancient version of virtue ethics in the South Asian tradition, insofar as virya is an essential feature of the jiva, and then right action is supposed to conform to that essential virtue. Consequentialism is the idea that the good ends justify the right means. So I think certainly early Buddhism is a clear version. In this edited volume, Kishore Chakravarti argues that that Nyaya, the article on Nyaya argues that Nyaya is a version of consequentialism. Then we have deontology. So deontology is the idea that there are these good rules, there's good things to do or choose, and then we should only select those that we have that pass some type of procedural test. Okay, so the deontologist will then distinguish between all sorts of good things we could do, but only some of them are going to be the right thing, and we should be choosing the right thing. Then finally, and I think this is what really interesting about this research, or thinking rather clearly about methodology, is that you see that yoga/bhakti is a 4th and distinct ethical theory that is the mirror opposite of virtue ethics. So yoga/bhakti is the view that the right practice produces good outcomes over time. Okay, and we can say more about this. So this is a kind of more fleshed out account of the ethical theory of yoga in the Yoga Sutra, but it's the same theory that's operating in the Gītā, and of course it goes back to the Upanishads. But the idea of yoga bhakti is that there's a procedural ideal of right action, namely Ishvara, sovereignty. And then sovereignty in turn is characterized by 2 essential traits, being unconservative and self-governing. And in order to cash out in practical terms approximating sovereignty, we have to engage in tapas, which is the practice of unconservatism, and swadhyaya, which is the practice of determining oneself, right? So it literally means self-study, but in the context of yoga, to study something is to take responsibility for it, right? Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. You have to take responsibility for how you relate to your what it is that you contemplate. So if you take responsibility for contemplating yourself, you're thereby self-governing against the backdrop of yoga. So yoga then is a fourth ethical theory. It's a radically procedural ethical theory. And it's radically procedural because in order to understand what the right is for yoga and bhakti, you don't need to understand what the good is. And it's the only of the four ethical theories where understanding the right does not involve any specification of the good. The good is simply just the perfection of the practice. And so when you're engaged in yoga, you don't worry. This is where the don't worry about outcomes, etc. comes from, right? You're not judging the value or the meaningfulness of your practice in terms of the outcome when you're engaging in yoga. Rather, what makes your practice meaningful is that it constitutes a devotion to this procedural ideal of what it is to be a person, what it is to act, namely Ishvara. Okay, so it took me a while to really appreciate this, right? We're so used to interpreting South Asian philosophy, so talk about Ishvara is then interpreted against familiar ethical theories like theism. Theism is a version of virtue ethics that says that there's an ultimately good God, and the choices of God are the right things for us to do, right? And so it's very easy against the backdrop of interpretation to look at arguments for Ishvara and think, oh, theism. I used to do that myself. But then when we're assiduous and we're careful about explication, you realize that the argument for Ishvara is not that it's good, but that it's right. And that devotion to Ishvara is not about being good, but about being right, which means that you make certain kinds of decisions and you engage in certain kinds of practices, and most importantly, you take the responsibility on yourself for understanding what that sovereignty looks like in your life. Okay, so it's a slightly different discussion, but theism, I think, really is vulnerable to kind of Euthyphroian worries about, like, how do you know what God to follow, right? Whereas Ishvara Pranidhana is like, no, you are taking the responsibility on yourself to understand what sovereignty looks like in practice in your life, right? So it's not about deferring passing the buck on to someone else to tell you how to live your life. It's all about you taking on the responsibility to do that yourself. So, all right. Now, what's useful about these distinctions? I'm sorry, I'm just gonna. What's useful about these distinctions is that it allows us to track the ethical theories involved in various pivotal moments in the Mahabharata and the Gītā. So now I'm just going to fast forward. Before I was talking about the dice. I'll come back to this, the game of dice. But now I'm looking at Arjuna's lament, right, at the start of the Gītā before Krishna launches into his lecture, right? And so he says a bunch of things, right? If he was to fight the war, it would result in sorrowful outcomes for all concerned. That's a consequentialist criticism. Though the enemy is evil, fighting would render him, Arjuna, no better than the opponent, rendering it the wrong virtue-destroying choice. Virtue ethics. Deontology. War undermines good social practices that, among other things, protect women and children. Right? This is like a Kantian deontological argument, right? That there are these kinds of rules that relate. In an idealized community, there are certain good practices that help us relate to each other. That's why we choose them on the kingdom of ends formulation. And Arjuna is saying here, well, war will just destroy those things. So Arjuna's lament then, there are three different kinds of reasons that he provides. And there are three ethical theories that support each of those. Consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology. Okay, now, what's interesting about these three ethical theories is that they all give importance to the good. Okay, so consequentialism is concerned with good outcomes, virtue ethics is concerned with good character, and deontology is concerned with good rules. Now, what's also interesting is that the game of dice becomes a metaphor for these three goods, right? So when you engage in the game of dice, there's a promise of a good outcome. Why does Yudhishthira take up the challenge? Because it's part of his, he sees it as part of his martial virtues, as not backing down from a challenge, willing to take risks, right? So there's a kind of virtue ethical, and then also good rules, insofar as the assumption is, of course, that it's a fair game, right? But insofar as you can imagine a fair game of dice, right, there's going to be good rules that everybody's going to be able to endorse. So the same ethical theories that are involved in Arjuna's lament help us understand why the game of dice would have seemed acceptable to engage in if you are willing to buy what I'm calling conventional morality. So conventional morality is basically the morality that the kind of morality that Bhishma is willing to endorse. It's what's usually endorsed, but the key defining elements of conventional morality is its concern for the good outcomes, good character, good rules. Okay, now what's, I think, a shining lesson from the Mahabharata is that conventional morality is consistent with systemic discrimination, and it's right, and injustice, and that it's rife for manipulation. Why is it rife? Why is it consistent with all of this? Because it gives rise to what we could call moral parasites, the Kauravas. So moral parasite is someone who wants you to be conventionally good so they can take advantage of you, right? They themselves have no interest in being bound by these rules themselves, but they want you to be bound by them, right? So what ends up happening is that if you are conventionally good, it's like you're wearing velvet handcuffs, okay? Because what ends up happening is that you won't preemptively get rid of moral parasites, because that would be a departure from conventional morality. You also will not retaliate, because that also will be a departure from conventional morality, right? So the Pandavas at any point in the game of dice could have got up and objected to the entire proceedings. But in order to do that, they would have had to have ditched conventional ethical expectations of how they should have behaved. They could have, but they chose not to, right? I think what's also interesting here is that one of the lessons, and this becomes clearer by the end of the Gītā, but certainly by the beginning of Gītā, is that the psychological life of someone who pins their hopes on conventional morality depends upon the vicissitudes of luck, right? So when there's the prospects of winning, the Pandavas Arjuna doesn't seem to be upset about conventional morality. When the prospects of losing at the start of the Gītā are vivid, then he's depressed, right? It's the same ethical commitment in both cases, but luck has changed, right? Before, it seemed like luck could have been on the Pandavas' side. And now, as they're facing war, it seems like luck is against them, right? Who thinks that war is a good thing? Nobody. You want to win war, but you don't really want to fight it, right? Because it's bad. And they appreciated that themselves, which is why they tried to avoid it at all costs. But here they are, they couldn't push it off any further. There was no other way of, they'd exhausted every means of conciliation, and there they were. And so now he's depressed, right? So I think what's interesting about conventional morality is that it leads to a kind of psychological, this is one of the lessons, I think, of the Mahabharata and the Gītā. It leads to a kind of psychological instability, because insofar as you are pinning your hopes on good outcomes, good character, good rules, etc., it all depends upon whether those good things obtain or not. And this is, of course, a really important lesson of all of this, is that outcomes are game theoretic functions of the choices of different actors, right? So even the war becomes a kind of metaphor for this, right? What happens in a war, who wins, is a function of everybody's choices. So insofar as you are trying to pin your hopes on some type of good outcome, you don't have control. This is, of course, an important part of Krishna's discourse. You don't really get to choose that outcome, right? You get to choose what you're going to do, but you don't really get to choose who wins, because that ends up being a function of everybody's activities and choices, right? So but psychologically, this is actually quite crushing, because if that's the case, if the outcomes are beyond our control, and that's what we're understanding our value system based on, that's what conventional morality does, then it seems like we're trying to coordinate around something we have no control over. That is depressing, right? At times it seems great, like when we're going to win the lottery, then we're happy. But when it's not going our way, then we're sad. Okay, so what Krishna does. So Krishna then, of course, provides Arjuna with this discourse on yoga, and there's 3 different versions, right? There's karma yoga, which is a deontology with an emphasis on the right. So it's different from the kind of kingdom of ends deontology that's involved in Arjuna's Lament, right? Because the kingdom of ends version is a kind of teleological version, if we could say that, because it depends upon the reality of the good rules that help us relate to each other in an ideal society, right? Karma yoga is all about your activity that you can perfect. That's also the right thing for you to do. So it takes that, it brings ethical choice within, and also the prospects of succeeding within the realm of the influence of the individual. Then there's Bhakti yoga, which is basically Patanjali's yoga, right? Ishvara Pranidhana. That ends up being the main story there. And then there's Jnana yoga, which is a kind of meta-ethical understanding of the prospects. Okay. So, right, so what does Krishna say? So he says, well, look, you're basically already, this is kind of, I think, the entailed lessons of his discourse, right? You're already kind of in a state of war, right? So Arjuna wants to take off at this moment, and Krishna has to kind of, you don't really have a choice, you're compelled to choose. But there's also, within the wider context, Arjuna, when he's having this lament, is pretending as though he's not already a victim of this harassment, right? And he is, and so are the Pandavas. Conventional morality, and this, I think, is one of the things we learn from this kind of, especially when you look at the wider discourse, right? Conventional morality was basically the Kauravas' weapon. They bet upon the Pandavas' willingness to abide by these conventional ethical rules as a constant that allowed them to configure all sorts of belligerence, right? And what does Krishna say? Well, we got to reset the moral order, right? And so how do you do that? Well, it's bhakti, right? You have to be devoted. You have to understand your ethical choices, not in terms of conventional expectations, because the conventional expectations have been corrupted by this point. And you reset it by engaging in yoga. Okay, so what ends up happening, right? So why is it that engaging in yoga is really going to have this transformative effect? Because yoga as a theory is about devotion to the right, not the good. And so as you engage in yoga, you no longer rely upon conventional morality to inform your decisions, but then you're no longer a sitting duck for the harassment of moral parasites, because the moral parasite needs you to be conventionally good so that you don't retaliate, that you don't break conventional ethical expectations, and then that gives them an advantage, right? But when you switch to yoga, you are no longer playing by conventional ethical expectations. And Krishna, this is shown in the Mahabharata. Krishna counsels the Pandavas to do all sorts of things that depart from conventional expectations, but they win, right? And I mean, one way to realize that this was just is that by that point, the conventional expectations were corrupt, and they were corrupt because they were used as a weapon against the conventionally good by those who don't wish to be bound by those expectations themselves. I think what's interesting, right, by the end of the Gītā, Arjuna has this transformation, right? He's no longer despondent and upset. He also has a sense of confidence with respect to what he needs to do. And so, right, what do we learn from this? That, well, these kind of there's a kind of teleological consciousness, right? And this is the consciousness of conventional morality, where you want good things, but all of that depends upon luck, because good outcomes are not completely under your control. They are a function of multi-party players and their choices, etc. And so, insofar as you orient yourself around these good outcomes, your psychology is going to be subject to the vicissitudes of luck. Even in the case of certain versions of deontology that really make big of good rules that everybody can endorse, right, you're going to have this problem. The karma yoga that Krishna emphasizes, while deontological, places an emphasis not on the goodness of the practice, but the rightness of you choosing their practice. So it helps you move away from the good. Yoga Bhakti consciousness, right? So it's not dependent. So when you switch to Yoga Bhakti, basically the same ethical theory, your value system is no longer dependent upon the good. And so you're no longer then orienting yourself around something that depends on luck, right? You are rather focused on your own practice. And that is, by definition, something under your own control, okay? And you make this possible by saying, I'm not going to worry about the good. I'm going to focus on the ideal of the right. And that's going to inform my choices. Okay, so one of the interesting things that I think about this transformation and Arjuna's transformation is that he goes from being tied to conventional ethical standards to being a yogi, at least temporarily. Maybe later on, after the war's ended, he switches back. Conventional morality is the morality of injustice. It allows for moral parasites. It also allows for a kind of bipolarity in consciousness, right? This kind of penduluming between excitement and euphoria for outcomes when things look like they're going your way, and then depression and despondency. I'm almost done. Depression and despondency when things are not going your way. So the psychological instability of a life oriented around conventional morality correlates with conventional morality making room for moral parasites, injustice. Okay, and then you switch to Yoga Bhakti, where it's the procedural ideal of the right Ishvara that then becomes what it is that you devote yourself to as a practitioner. Then you take your psychology then is not focused around something that's dependent upon luck. It's rather dependent upon sovereignty. The ideal of sovereignty, but as you practice, it becomes increasingly your sovereignty. So if I think about, especially these days, when I think about social justice movements, and of course, this is something I meant. It's in a way common knowledge, but I think it needs to be said more, right? Like Gandhi cites the Yoga Sutra as the source of his political doctrines in a variety of writings. And then Gandhi, of course, and in fact, if you want to see the locus classicus, it's around Yoga Sutra Book 2, Sutras 33 to 35, where Patanjali pretty much sets out direct action. And then, right, so Gandhi does what he does, and then Martin Luther King in the States, and that now I'm in North America, and I'm seeing Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements that are a genealogical descendant of yoga. And one of the interesting things that, one of the challenges for activists who are bucking conventional morality, but deciding to base their practice on a devotion to sovereignty, right, is the possibility of burnout. That you might just start to get exhausted, morally exhausted, because it's a struggle and the rewards or the outcomes are not easily or quickly forthcoming, right? But the practice of yoga / bhakti corrects for this, because you're not understanding the meaningfulness of what you're doing in terms of the success, right? So insofar as you engage in protests against injustice, you're doing it because that's part of Ishvara Pranidhana for you, that your own devotion to sovereignty, not because you're expecting that it's going to make a big difference, right? So the people who get burnt out have this consequentialist view of what they're doing. They think of protest as a kind of tactic to get some further end. But for the yogi, it's how you live your life, right? And the meaningfulness of that has to do with Ishvara Pranidhana. So anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say. So if I was to summarize, right, that there's this correlation between psychological health, consciousness, between conventional morality on the one hand and yoga bhakti on the other hand, and then also the possibilities of injustice, that we allow for injustice as we adopt the posture of conventional morality. I take this to be the lesson, one of the main lessons of this transformation, Arjuna's transformation, and that we become an active resistor to injustice when we abandon conventional morality and then reconfigure ourselves as devoted to the ideal, the procedural ideal. Anyways, thank you so much. I'm done with my talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shyam, for that wonderful presentation, scholarly presentation that you have given. The proceedings for Dr. Gītēsh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. I take this opportunity to conclude this session. I think Dr. Shyam mapped an elaborate journey of Indian ethics, explicating the 5 theories, 4 + 1, 5 theories, and its applicability within the framework of Arjuna's transformation, or better say, their play in the scheme of Mahabharata, which can definitely become a point of research for a lot of younger scholars present in the list of participants. Very aptly, he pointed out that there are different concepts of Dharma within South Asian tradition, yet we have no disagreements. So this is something we definitely have to look at and feel good about the whole tradition. Through philosophical analysis of the episode of Bhagavad Gītā, Dr. Shyam shed light on how resetting the moral order is the yogic bhakti approach of ethics, while he even explained that yoga as a theory is undoubtedly an allegiance to right and not just good, which we all can take back as a point of reflection out of all the points that he mentioned in today's session. Well, Dr. Shyam, on behalf of Dr. Bala, the team SPARC, Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, Kamla Nehru College, all participants present here, and myself, I thank you for sparing time for us by joining today early in the morning for sharing your philosophical insights on the theme of the day. I think it's a privilege. It's been a privilege for us to have you amongst us. I thank all the participants for being with us each time, each Saturday, be it morning or evening. In fact, it's your presence which inspires us to keep arranging more and more of such engaging sessions on Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gītā every Saturday. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to our esteemed speaker of the day. Thank you to the technical team and all the support that we get from various sources. I request all the participants to follow our social media handles as well as promote our events wherever and whenever you can. And I would even request you to share your constant feedback with us, for which we send out our forms on Monday, almost every Monday every week. And let us know who are the other speakers you would like to hear, which will actually encourage us to invite all of them on this platform. Thank you all. And at the end, I request all the participants to switch on their videos so that we can have photographs. Okay, I'm on the page 1 right now. Page 2. Back to page 1. Thank you all. Wish you all a pleasant evening and a very happy day ahead, Dr. Shyam, to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Shyam.
you.
And thank you all. It's wonderful.
Thank you.